took my daughters to the library the other day. It was for a science program. It was good. They sat in a big classroom with a bunch of other kids. They got to learn about blood. They got to share their COVID germs with kids from all over the county. And it was educational and nice. It was paid for by the state. I appreciated it. I was glad it was a good find on Joanna's part. So I did, though, when I was walking in, I saw they have these giant windows out front, and they often have sort of displays of books or art projects or things up there. And they had this thing, I guess they'd done it for Valentine's Day, but it was a giant heart made up of a lot of little hearts, each one maybe the size of a hand turkey, roughly. And they were all different colors. And they had been arranged in, they had been put up individually to make up the shape of the larger heart. But on each of the individual hearts, a child, based on the handwriting, a child had written the name of a book that he or she loved, right? Where the red fern grows, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I don't know if that's anyone's favorite, but there was some Harry Potter up there. There was some Percy Jackson. There was some Madeline L'Engle. There were a bunch of names I didn't recognize. But at any rate, there were these nice names of books up there. It was good to see, sort of heartwarming. And then in the corner, sort of right at the edge of the heart, I noticed a little blue heart. And instead of the name of a beloved children's book, someone had just written, "I love horror!" And I thought, that sort of sours the mood. It's a little, in context it makes enough sense, but it just leaves a kind of a funny taste in the mouth in the company of all those pleasant children's titles. Then on the way out of the library, when my kids had done the science activity, my daughter ran up and said, "Oh, let me find my heart. Hey, there it is." And she pointed to the little blue heart that said, "I love horror." And I thought, of course, it's my fucking kid. So this put me in mind of, I heard not long ago some podcast hosts talking about the poem Good Bones. Now, Good Bones it was a poem by Maggie Smith, American poet, went super, super viral, and got passed all around the internet. And I think she published a collection called Good Bones, and then published a whole other collection. She kind of built a whole brand off of it. Dan Coast did kind of an interesting article in Slate about how that poem had affected her life, and maybe it had become something of an albatross, though, honestly, most of us would happily take an albatross like that. It's a good poem. I think Good Bones is well done. I think it's, a lot of poets privately sort of shit on it, but I think it does what it does quite well. It's approachable. It's charming. It has a kind of a recognizable human voice. It's something you can relate to. It's about raising children. It's funny. It's sad. It's touching, and it has a really well managed ending. I think it's an accomplished little poem. Now, these podcast hosts, they'd never encountered it before. One of them had just read it for the first time the other day, and then she was reading it to the other host, who also had never read it, and they were just talking about how great it was. They just thought, wow, what a poem. That's poetry. None of this nonsense we're used to. That's a real poem. And I thought, yeah, that is pretty well done. But there was a line in it that I heard for the first time. I'd never really heard it before. There's a line about halfway through. It's in her to be sure paragraph, so to speak. It's a short poem, but she says, "The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate, though I keep this from my children." And then she has this little litany of some of the ways in which the world is actually bad. Right? She says, "For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird." And that was the line I heard for the first time. I thought, well, wait a minute. Let's think about that for a second. For every bird, there's a stone thrown at a bird. And so I Googled, because I didn't know. Typed into Google, how many birds are there in the world? So it turns out the answer is 50 billion. There are 50 billion birds in the world. And that made me think, okay, so I guess that means, if there are 50 billion birds, and I'm assuming that in a year, because there are going to be birds that live and die every year, that are born and die every year. But I'm assuming in a year, you have 50 billion birds, and for every one of those, there's a stone thrown at a bird. I mean, if a bird's life is, how long is a bird's life? Let's see. How long do birds live? Oh man, there's a big range there. How long does I like to type complete sentences into Google, because I just see it as a sign of respect. Assuming it's only one stone per bird's life, I guess that's probably possible. It's 50 billion stones being thrown. But then here is where I started to run into trouble. So I thought, like, with any large-scale behavior, there's sort of an 80-20 rule, right? Which we understand to be like 20% of the customers cause 80% of the customer complaints, right? Like 20% of the population commits 80% of the crimes. Yeah, we're sort of familiar with this. Similarly, like, 20% of the workforce in any given company is going to perform like 80% of the work, right? It's just in terms of efficiency for good or ill. This is sort of how things tend to break down. So it's not that because there are 8 billion people in the world, and there are going to be, over the course of any bird's life, way more birds than people all throughout that bird's life. So, it's not that every person is having to throw several stones at a bird per lifetime, right? Like, what would that be? Like 8 times 6 is 48. So like every person would be throwing 6 stones in his lifetime at a bird. Except that people live longer than birds. And so really it would be probably a lot more than that. It would be more like if the average bird lifespan is between seabirds live 30 to 50 years, but warblers live, 3 to 6 years. So assuming like a human's lifespan is going to encompass the lifespan of anywhere between 2 and 10 or 20 birds, that's to multiply that by 6, and that's still quite a lot of stones per person per lifetime. But of course, most people don't throw any stones at birds, right? Assuming the 80-20 rule, we've actually just got a relatively small percentage of the population throwing almost all of the stones. And here's where it gets really thorny. What that means is that percentage of the population is probably getting pretty good at throwing stones, right? So you've actually got a lot of very accurate stones being thrown at birds, meaning that a lot of these stones are making contact and presumably, because a lot of birds are quite small, killing the birds. Now, once you kill a bird, what that means is that bird is no longer counted as one of the birds who exists, which means that for every one of the birds that still exists, there's even more stones being thrown. So it turns out that like 12 to 240 stones per person per lifetime is actually a radical underestimate. When you look at the smaller number of people who are actually throwing these stones, it just seemed like there's sort of a bird holocaust going on here. But then I got to the next line, and the next line is even more disturbing, because here's the next line. So for every bird, there's a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, a child broken, bagged, sunk in a lake. And I thought, for every loved child, a child broken, bagged, sunk in a lake. I thought that's terrible. For every loved child, a child dies? But then it's not quite that, right? Because we're not talking about accidental deaths. We're not talking about car wrecks or even like drive-by shootings that, accidentally hit a bystander. We're talking about serial killings, right? Because that's what a broken, bagged, and sunk in a lake means, right? That's a well-organized, premeditated murder. That's a serial killer, yeah? So for every loved child, a child is serial killed. And then I thought, well, now hold on a minute. How many children are there in the world? The World Bank estimates that 25% of the population at any given time is between the ages of 0 and 14, which means, if the world population is about 8 billion, that means there are 2 billion children. And, just like guessing conservatively, let's just say conservatively, at least half of all children are loved, right? It's got to be at least half are loved. And because we're not talking about just like they're well treated, not rich, not nourished properly. This is just loved. And this is loved by anybody because it's done in the passive voice, right? For every loved child. So, that means that like we're just talking about the kids who are loved by anybody, like mom, dad, grandma, the mailman, the dog, right? Somebody loves these children. And of course, like kids are relatively cute and are, we're genetically inclined to love them. And so a kid who nobody loves, that kid's got to be just dog shit. That's got to be a terrible kid. And that's, according to Maggie Smith, that's half of kids, right? Because it's half the kids are loved, half of the kids are serial killed. That gives us roughly 1 billion children being serial killed over every 14 years, right? 1 billion children over 14 years being killed, presumably, right? And given that 3/5 of all serial killers live in the United States, that means that the serial killers in the United States alone are responsible for 600 million child murders every 14 years. So what are we looking at? 300 million child, like the population of America is murdered by Americans, serial murdered by Americans every 7 years. That means there's a colossal murder tourism industry. And here's where we run into the same problem with the birds. Like, once those children are killed, then the number of loved children, once you take those, 50% of children and you serial kill them, then the number of loved children is actually 100%, right? Because all the loved children are not killed. And that means we're having to rejigger our numbers. So the total number of murders is actually way larger. Like, think of the rivers of blood. Think of the global charnel house that this predicts. I mean, this is like war crimes beyond any scale we've ever encountered. I mean, the Holocaust, there were like 11 million people murdered in Hitler's camps. Stalin murdered like 20 million. We're talking about 1 billion every 14 years. And then I remember the poem's ending, right, which is, any decent realtor walking you through a real shithole chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. You could make this place beautiful. No, you couldn't. These bricks are baked with the bones of children. This whole place is soaked in blood. This is a nightmare. Anyone who could possibly switch from the subject of 1 billion children being murdered and sunk in a lake to a cute metaphor about real estate and how we should all look on the bright side, that person has got to be a psychopath. Maggie Smith is an absolute stone cold psychopath, and statistically speaking, also a serial killer. So I just got back in town. Saw the girls, gave them little airport presents, got them fed and put to bed, caught up with Joanna, and we finished watching this TV series, limited series that we had started, months ago at this point. It's called Fleischman is in Trouble. It's based on a novel she read by a woman who is a Taffy Brodesser Acker, I think is her name. She wrote profiles of celebrities in GQ or Esquire somewhere for years, some men's magazine, and then quit. And a few years later came out with this novel about a man going through a divorce, and his friend, the woman who wrote profiles of celebrities in some men's magazine, and then had an existential crisis and ultimately comes out with a novel. So you get the idea. It was a pretty good series. Had some interesting stuff in it. Good cast for the most part, and a lot of like delightful actors playing insufferable characters, which is okay. Which I don't mind so much. Some class stuff that God love the New Yorkers. I know a fair number of New Yorkers listen to this podcast, and God bless all of you. Not that you believe in God, but boy, let me just say, it is possible to depict you on television in a way that makes one think there may be problems with the larger category of New Yorkers. Not fair, I'm sure, of course, but boy, this show was not good advertising for the fundamental moral character of people who live in New York City. Not even people who live in New York City, people who prosper in New York City, I should say. At any rate, my favorite character among all of the TV show characters, because I didn't read the book, was Lizzie Kaplan's character. She played the author's stand-in for herself. She's the friend who. Friend of the divorced guy who used to write profiles of celebrities in some men's magazine, and then has an quits the magazine, has an existential crisis. In during the movie or the TV show, she's having her existential crisis. Lizzie Kaplan is, as always, brilliant and funny and poignant, very expressive face, very memorable eyes, and charming delivery of her lines. So I really liked her. I liked her character, even if I didn't admire her character. And she's this fundamentally depressed housewife who's totally disillusioned with her existence and knows that she's extremely fortunate, knows that her husband loves her, that her children are treasures, that she is blessed in almost every way that she could wish for, and yet she is fundamentally unhappy. I liked her. I liked watching her. I liked following her story much more than any of the other character stories. And at the end of the series, she gives this description to her friend, the divorce guy, of the book she's going to write, the novel she's going to write. And of course, the novel she's going to write is the novel that then inspires the TV show that we are watching in that moment, where everything she's describing, including the way the book ultimately ends, it all lines up with the show. There's this perfect parallel between the two. There's an analog relationship between the two. And then she has this wonderful epiphany at the end, where she realizes that her unhappiness is really nobody's fault, and instead of feeling miserable with her life, she should feel grateful and happy. And then she does feel grateful and happy, and she goes home to her husband and hugs him and cherishes him and tells him that she's sorry, and he very lovingly forgives her and takes her back in, and then everything's fine. A couple things bothered me about this ending. One being that the epiphany is basically a sort of a nonsense finger snap. It is a psychological deus ex machina, whereby the precise logic that had so previously so aggravated her disillusionment, right? The idea that it was so unwarranted, suddenly becomes a frictionless solution to it. The other thing that bothered me about it, I think, is that obviously, the other, and maybe I would say the real redemption of her whole storyline, right? Her whole sense of her crisis, her sense of disillusionment, her misery, her failure to feel gratitude and happiness. All of those problems, the real redemption for all of that. We have to remember that redemption specifically means the paying off. You redeem tickets at an arcade by cashing them in for prizes, right? You redeem money for goods, right? Redemption involves the price, right? Something is turned in for its value. Yeah. So what the real redemption of this character's misery is that ultimately she will write this novel, which will be a dazzling success, right? That's the actual redemption, is that everything in this world, the world of the story, is paid for, is covered, is made okay, and even more than okay. Rather than being a period of unhappiness, it's a period of good fortune. It's an asset rather than being a deficiency. All of this time wandering around New York, smoking cigarettes and despising her husband, all of this is actually, in the end, is not only okay, it's not only come to an end, it's actually worth it because of what it is redeemed for or redeemed by. And, watching this, I couldn't help but think of an experience from my trip to Atlanta. While there, I went to Mass for the first time in a few years. It's been a little while. Mass is, of course, the Catholic word for the church service that you go to every week. It's a particular thing. It's not just, gathering and having a meeting and a guy preaches something. There is a particular series of actions that have to occur. There's a liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, and both of these things have to take place, along with a number of other rites and rituals. So we went to that big cathedral, lots of priests, lots of high ceremony, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful place, and there is a beauty to some of the ceremony. And of course, I've been to Mass hundreds and hundreds of times in my life, and I know it pretty well, but it had been a while, and I think it landed a little differently on me this time. And in particular, the sermon landed differently on me. In the sermon, the priest presented this really, really long, elaborate, well, I shouldn't say elaborate, belabored is probably a more accurate term, this belabored metaphor that involved traveling through the Atlanta airport. If you don't know the Atlanta airport, it is indeed the busiest airport in the world. It is, in the world, in the country at least, maybe the world, it is pretty fucking busy. It's also enormous. There is an internal train system just to get you from gate to gate because it's so big. And if you have passed through it, you know that there is a kind of an illusory quality to, you passing through one hall and one gate and one atrium after another, and feeling like you've gotten closer only to discover that you're still miles away from your destination within this airport. There's row after row of Hudson Newses and food courts, and one gate could easily be another. It's if everything weren't labeled with letters and numbers, it would be it might all just be a hall of mirrors. And he describes walking through the airport and then coming to when you are arriving, coming to this massive escalator. It is very big. I think it's probably, there's an escalator in the Washington, D.C. Metro that is very, very long, but I think this one might be longer. There's a very big, ugly mural from when the Olympics were held in Atlanta that you get to take in at length as you go up this escalator. And then at the top, there's the people waiting to receive their arriving parties. He built up to this moment when you arrive at the top of the escalator. And of course, every single person in the church knew where this was going from pretty early on in this sermon. We all knew that finally, ultimately, the arrival at the top of the escalator was going to be a symbol for an image of the arrival of the soul in heaven, and the welcoming party of all of the souls dearly departed, of all of the family members and friends who predeceased one, so that you're greeted by all those who loved you before and reunited. And of course they're standing up there just like the USO, just like the limousine drivers holding up their signs and their balloons for you. And how lovely and how happy. And this was, as you might imagine, fucking infuriating to hear. Almost as infuriating as hearing that everything in your life, your work, your memories, your experience, your relationships, every aspect of your life, your senses, your hopes, your ambitions, your failures, your embarrassments, your triumphs, your accidents, every moment of your life, every grain and fiber of your life, all of it adds up. Although the total of all of it is negligible, is effectively nothing compared to your existence in the afterlife. in heaven, you are far more, immeasurably more than you were on earth. And you might as well forget everything on earth. That is to say that life is redeemed by the afterlife would be an understatement, right? Everything it's not just Virgil saying someday this pain will be useful to you. It's not just Taffy Broadus or Acker saying, someday this existential crisis will pay off in a best-selling straight to Hulu adaptation novel for you. But the redemption, the payoff, the epiphany, the revelation will so outweigh what came before that you could almost forget everything that came before. The promise of that we receive in life is so much more than answered by the afterlife that you might as well never have existed. Your existence in life might as well just be a shadow. Might as well be like the lives of the Greek shades, washed down with the water of Lethe and forgotten. And I don't know if I've been that angry at a priest since I graduated from Catholic school. But thankfully, on the airplane flying home, I picked up Teatro Grottesco, the Thomas Ligotti collection that I got for Brian and me because the first story in it was Purity, which we already discussed. And I liked it, and I was sort of intrigued by it. I was intrigued by things I'd heard about Ligotti elsewhere, so I kept reading. I read a couple more stories, and on the plane, I read one of these stories called Sideshow it's made up of a series of shorts, just stories that just, maybe 2 pages. And the best of these, by my lights, was called The Malignant Matrix. And all of them are they're sort of like joke vignettes that have cryptic but evocative titles. We never quite hear what the Malignant Matrix is, but it seems in some way to pick up on an undertone in the book, in the story itself. So I really liked this story, and here's the basic gist of it. The gist of it is that the narrator is some sort of correspondent for scientists, for the most elite and advanced scientists and philosophers and academics of his time. He is sort of like he's the Soren Wheeler of his fictional sci-fi horror age. And he takes notes from all of the great scientists and all of their new discoveries. He's appraised of everything that they apprised. Do we say apprised? I should look that up. Here's another one of my fucking malapropisms. Yeah, keep me apprised. That's right, it is apprise. Oh wow, yeah. So we got a few words, right? So we have appraise, to assess the value or quality of. We have apprise, which is to inform or tell, and we have apprise with a Z, which is either to appraise with an AISE, or to value highly. Also, the British spell that word the same way as the word apprise, APPRISE. So total chaos. Anyway, the narrator is kept apprised of the leading scientists' latest discoveries, and we hear that he gets special news one day. One day I received a very special communication. This is straight from the story, The Malignant Matrix. One day I received a very special communication whereby I learned that an astounding and quite unexpected breakthrough had been achieved. The culmination, it appeared, of many years of intense scientific and metaphysical study. This breakthrough, the communication informed me, concerned nothing less than the discovery of the true origins of all existential phenomena, both physical and metaphysical, the very source, as I understood the claims being made, of existence in the broadest possible sense. And he's given He's given very explicit instructions to come receive this news at a specific time and a specific location. So he goes on to say he follows the directions. He goes precisely to the place that is that's identified by his correspondent. He says, I could not help imagining that I would ultimately find myself a visitor at a sophisticated research facility of some kind, a shining labyrinth of the most innovative devices and apparatus of extraordinary complexity. This is all very consistent with his experience and with the character and quality of his correspondence in the sciences, and that he keeps close notes on and tracks very scrupulously in his own writing. He discovers, though, that it's not a glittering and sprawling laboratory that is waiting for him at the address specified in his instructions. Instead, he arrives at a large, decrepit building, and he finds a small door at the end of a dark and narrow alley that ran along the side of the old building. I opened the door and stepped inside, barely able to see 2 paces in front of me, for by now it was the middle of the night. There was a faint click as the door closed behind my back, and all I could do was wait for my eyesight to adjust to the darkness. He goes on, moonlight shone down through a window somewhere above me and spread dimly across a dirty concrete floor. I could see that I was standing at the bottom of an empty stairwell. And then this is what makes me just fucking love this story. He's come to receive news of this unexpected, unprecedented scientific breakthrough, the discovery of the true origins of all existential phenomena. So he says, I heard faint sounds of something dragging itself directly toward me. Then I saw this just again, I keep reading this on the airplane. This guy at the bottom of the stairwell, I kept imagining the priest describing the arrival at the top of the escalator. But this is Ligotti. Here, back to Ligotti. He says, then I saw what it was that had emerged from a shadowy area of that empty stairwell. It was a head. It was a head, supported by a short length of neck, on which it pulled itself along like a snail, moving by inches upon the concrete floor. Its features were indistinct, yet nonetheless seemed deformed or mutilated, and it was making sounds whose meaning I could not comprehend, its angular jaw opening and closing mechanically. And he discovers that there's something else down there with him, not much larger than the head, that was approaching me across the floor. This other object was, to my eyes, an almost wholly shapeless mass, quite pale, which I was able to identify as animated tissue only because, every so often, it opened itself up like a giant bivalved mollusk found at great suboceanic depths. And it made the same sound as the crawling head was making, both of them crying out at the bottom of that dim and empty stairwell, the place I had been informed where I might confront the source of all existential phenomena. The story goes on a little while longer, but it just seems perfect. I read it, and it made me laugh in my Comfort Plus airplane seat, and I looked at the lady sitting next to me in her pink Beats by Dre over-ear headphones, and I looked to my right at the at the emergency exit door and the giant silver handle that I had watched one of the stewards switch to the armed position, informing me that if I were to pull on it, it would rip a panel off the side of the airplane as we were flying thousands of feet above the air. And I thought, this, not the priest's obscene fucking metaphor, not his claim that the dead can do much more for us in heaven than they could ever do for us on earth. Not any of that. not even the fucking Eucharist, but this moment in this story where the Ligottian Soren Wheeler, where the science journalist arrives at the bottom of this dirty concrete stairwell, and he's confronted by this independently animated, creaking head dragging itself on its neck like a snail across the dirty floor toward this shapeless, fleshy mollusk creature. Both of them crying out to each other in indecipherable terms. And I thought, this is what rings true, and no, Elijah, not because I think that the universe at its bottom is a hideous and senseless nightmare. No, it is not that I believe that, which I do, that makes me respond with such delighted recognition to this image. It's not this confrontation with Boschian visions of hell at the bottom of a dirty stairwell. It's not that this all reflects my beliefs about existence at large. It's that it is the answer. It is the payoff. It is the redemption of the promise he was made by his scientific friends that he was going to receive the answers to it all. That is what makes this ring true. That's what makes it ring so much truer than the priest's despicable promises, or even the heartwarming ending of the Hulu limited TV series adapted from the feel-good contemporary novel by the former Men's Magazine celebrity profiler. This, the correspondence between the promise of a clear, defined, provable, repeatable, measurable, fundamentally reliable answer to it all. The pairing of that promise with an experience of absolute, childlike, uncanny horror. At the end of this fucking week, at the end of this insane trip, at the end of 7 nights in a row of critically insufficient sleep, that is what finally made me feel like something at last actually made fucking sense. I guess I should actually start the fucking show. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to Slee Ricketts. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially if you've taken a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to a friend. I really appreciate it. That is you are our advertising plan, much to Brian's chagrin. Thank you also to everyone who already subscribes to The Secret Show. It's been a lot of fun lately. There's a lot of stuff there that just doesn't end up fitting on the main feed. And I think if there's a particular, people have different kinds of sweet tooth for certain shows we do, but if you have a certain kind of sweet tooth for I'm not really quite sure how to characterize it. There's stuff you'll get there that you won't get elsewhere. You can tell me if this is too much of a dick move, but I've got so much stuff in the can right now that I'm thinking. I had a really good conversation with Stephen Marsh, the probably the most famous person I've had on here, I guess in like strict terms. He wrote a book on writing and failure, which was really fun and which I enjoyed, and which I did sort of disagree with. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, but I'm thinking, because there's so many other episodes I want to finally release that I've just had sitting there, I'm thinking I might just release his in its entirety on the Secret Show feed. Again, let me know if that's too shitty a thing to do. But on the other hand, the Secret Show is pretty cheap and pretty good it's pretty decent. You get your money's worth. And 2 other points. One, if money is a real problem for you when it comes to this kind of thing, send me a note. I'll help you out. Send me a note if that's a problem. Don't fret. Also, if you are rich, I haven't mentioned this in a while, but if you are rich, we have a special option just for you. Some of the subscribers have availed themselves of this. I am deeply grateful to all of you, but but I'm especially grateful to those of you who subscribe to the Secret Show at the rich person level. It is actually it is technically called the motherfucker of the arts level, and for those of you who are motherfuckers of the arts, I am my heart truly is yours. And the more the merrier. You are all welcome to become motherfuckers of the arts. Or just send me a fucking email and I will help you out if that's your deal. But do subscribe to the Secret Show. I always give Matt Wall grief in my mind when I have to skip ahead a bunch because he has like a 16-minute intro to every episode. But so I'll quit with this one now. I have been meaning to make this particular episode for a while. It's an episode, I have wanted to make an episode about meaning, and as much about meaninglessness as meaning. But as you could probably tell by the previous 40 minutes, is it more than that at this point? 40 minutes. Yeah, I think it's 40 minutes. Like legendary lesbian activist folk singer Ani DeFranco said, after she released an album full of apolitical love songs to a straight man, I got a little distracted. But I have wanted to release this episode for a while, and I have had so many different ideas and so many different poems I wanted to talk about that I finally decided the way to solve this problem, rather than waiting until I had a comprehensive plan, was just to do what Borges used to do. In fact, the story is, and if the story is false or some details of it happen to be false, don't correct my mistake, because I want to believe it so badly. When he was 40 and he had not yet begun writing, he said, or writing, fiction, he said, I always wanted to write these epic novels with really sprawling plots and philosophical digressions. And he realized one day that he was never going to get around to actually writing them. And so instead, he decided he would just imagine that he had already written them and then write an article summarizing the highlights. So that is, I think, what I'm going to do with this episode. This episode on meaning, this sprawling epic episode on meaning that I have never actually figured out how to make. I'm just going to summarize it for you and then give you a few of the poems that I thought might help illustrate the stuff I was getting at. So to start with, I want to talk about Richard Cory, fictional rich man, hero of Edwin Arlington Robinson's eponymous poem, Richard Cory, as well as the hit song Richard Cory by Simon and Garfunkel, by Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. This is Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from soul to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So on the one hand, this is a relatively straightforward poem. Richard Cory is a rich man. Everybody looks up to him. They all wish they were him. But actually, Richard Cory had other problems, and he killed himself. The man everybody wished that they could become didn't want himself to be a person any longer, or didn't want to be himself, at least. There is a reading of this poem. I don't think it's Robinson's reading, and I don't actually even think it's Simon and Garfunkel's reading, because they rewrote the poem basically. I mean, they took the general outlines of it, but they really wrote their own words. Yeah, I think the only line they kept really intact was the last line. I think that's, yeah, I think pretty much otherwise it's all paraphrased. But yeah, they say that Richard Cory owns one half of this whole town with political connections to spread his wealth around. Born into society, a banker's only child, he had everything a man could want. Power, grace, and style, but I work in his factory, and I curse the life I'm living, and I curse my poverty, and I wish that I could be blah, 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 blah. I wish that I could be Richard Cory. So the verses catalog all of the triumphs of Richard Cory, the rumors of his parties and the orgies on his yacht, and then the chorus rehearses the misery of the speaker and all of the people of the town. The people on the pavement, as Robinson calls them. A note that I think is not insignificant about this song is that after the final verse, so my mind was filled with wonder when the evening headlines read, Richard Cory went home last night and put a bullet through his head. You do kind of wonder, like, this seems like sort of a verbose headline. Usually headlines are a little more compressed than that. But it's after that final verse when the people on the pavement have come to realize that their illusions about Richard Cory are in fact just that really there was something happening, deep within him that was that caused him great pain. Even after that, they repeat the chorus. But I work in his factory, and I curse the life I'm living, and I curse my poverty, and I wish that I could be, I wish that I could be Richard Cory. That's how the song ends. And that, I think, is exactly right. I think Simon and Garfunkel they actually hit the nail on the head, because this poem, Richard Cory, is not about the man Richard Cory. It's certainly not about the experience of being Richard Cory. It's about the experience of seeing Richard Cory, of thinking about him from the outside. And I think that there is this reading, and so this is a point where I should say Stephen Marsh in our conversation was unbelievably generous. He was free and easy and funny and smart, and he had a lot to say about failure in writing. He wrote a very entertaining book on the subject, and he also charitably jumped in and said plenty about all of his writing, all the writing he's done on AI and AI, particularly composition, literary composition. That was a conversation that made me want to put a bullet through my head. but he was great. I mean, he was really, could not have been a nicer or more generous interview. But I do think there's a kind of argument that he makes in his book on failure that he's not alone in making. It's one I've heard a number of different places, and I think often when this poem has been, when I've heard this poem presented in public, it's sort of like the unbelievably snotty science professor who told us at the commencement for my graduation from Johns Hopkins, it was a science professor gave a. Oh, you know what? Maybe it was Ryan, because I think I skipped my own commencement. I think it was at Ryan's commencement. The keynote speaker was a Hopkins science professor who gave a whole talk about the road less traveled, as she put it, which is of course not the title of Frost's poem. And her interpretation, which is very common, was that the moral of the story is that you should do the thing other people aren't willing to do, and then the greater moral of her speech, because this was a commencement ceremony for people getting graduate degrees in the humanities. And they brought in a science professor from Johns Hopkins to give a speech, the moral of which was, hey, it may seem like you've gotten a degree that is in something utterly useless and frivolous, but in fact, just as I put the Robert Frost poem that I so profoundly misread above my desk so I could look at it and be inspired wrongly by it every day when I go to work at the science factory, you too could write a poem that some other scientist could read and then be moved to do her actually important work in the world. So that was her moral to all of us humanities students. I think this poem similarly is frequently misunderstood or misinterpreted. First, I tend to think like neither Robinson nor Frost would have wanted anyone to do the work of drawing a lesson from his poem, or at least would not want that to be the primary activity taken. I think, here's where I think Elijah and I may really disagree. And we get into that actually in one of the many episodes I really want to fucking put out there. I think that reading poems morally is usually a mistake. I think it is certainly a mistake in this case. But I think specifically the moral that people tend to extract from this poem is really the wrong one. Right? The moral people tend to extract from this poem is, well, you never know what's going on in someone else's life. And so you, who in this poem, right, we're told the people on the pavement worked and waited for the light and went without the meat and cursed the bread, right? Or in the Simon and Garfunkel song, even more harshly, they say, I curse the life I'm living and I curse my poverty, right? And in both cases, they wish they could be Richard Cory. The moral people tend to extract from this poem is, but you're only cursing your life because you don't know any better. You think that if you were Richard Cory, you would be happy, but in fact, if you were Richard Cory, you too would be miserable. And so you're wrong to curse your life, and you're wrong to curse your poverty, and you're wrong to think that you would rather be someone else, because in fact, he is just as miserable as you are. And that is the shittiest moral I've ever heard in my fucking life. And I think it's completely fucking backwards. I think this is why Simon and Garfunkel are totally, totally on point when they end their song with the same chorus. After reporting that Richard Cory has killed himself, they then say, and I wish that I could be, I wish that I could be Richard Cory. Because again, this is not a poem about Richard Cory. This is a poem about the people on the pavement and their experience from a distance. And I actually don't know that it's quite right to say, if we are going to try to extract a moral from this poem or this song, I don't know that it would be quite right to say, the moral is that there's something we don't know about Richard Cory. I think, you could make let me put it this way. I think the moral of Simon and Garfunkel's song, which is like a good deal more rhetorically straightforward, let's say, than Robinson's poem, which is a little subtler and has some sort of nice nuances where, he has these funny little to be sure qualifications. He says he was always quietly arrayed and he was always human when he talked. I love that line. He was always human when he talked. There's so much that's framed so carefully there. But he still fluttered pulses when he said good morning, and he glittered when he walked. Those pulses fluttered, that sensation. That's not happening in his body. That's happening in the bodies of the people who talk to him, presumably the women or the men who find him attractive, among other things. But I do think we could very easily say that the moral of the Simon and Garfunkel song, to the extent to which it has a moral, which probably is greater than the extent to which the poem does, the moral there is that no, it's not that there's something about Richard Cory's life that we don't know. Actually, there's something about Richard Cory's life that he doesn't know. And that's why we are actually right to say, I wish that I could be Richard Cory. And maybe the problem is not that if we were Richard Cory, we would also be miserable. Maybe the problem is that he doesn't realize that if we were Richard Cory, we would be happy. Now, setting that argument aside, because again, morality is not my favorite lens for reading any kind of art, I think that I am as irritated at this point by this line of argument, right? But the people who are more successful than you, guess what? They are looking up at the people across the street from them and wondering why they're not, richer and more successful. And so really you're wrong to wish that you had more. You're wrong to wish that your life were different, because if your life were different, the grass would still be greener, right? The problem with saying that the grass is always greener on the far side of the hill is that there's, sometimes you're right. Like sometimes the grass is greener on the other side of the hill because it's actually greener there. I tend to think that the Richard Cory argument, the argument that you should never envy someone who has things better than you do, I think that argument makes about as much sense as the first world problems argument. This was a routine that I think was pretty funny back when Louis C.K. was making it about cell phones like 15 years ago. But I think it's sort of become almost a a parody of itself. It's another, I think the second version of this was, these are white people problems. That is to say, it's a dismissal of certain kinds of complaints because, of course, we could have it worse, which is true, right? Like, we could have it worse. But again, like, as plenty of other people have pointed out, like, yeah, you could also have it worse than those people who have it worse than us. And you know who has it really bad? Octopuses, right? Like, octopuses are sentient and feel pain and fear and mourn their dead, and they're still killed and eaten, sometimes in some cultures eaten alive, purely for pleasure, by creatures who know that they're sentient and can feel pain and fear and mourn their dead, right? So octopuses have it real bad. Yeah. So let's in fact, none of us should complain about anything. The lowliest of the low shouldn't complain. Children who are trafficked across borders to work in meat factories, they should not be complaining because octopuses have it worse. So shut up, kids. You're taking too long a bathroom break. Get back to processing that meat. But I think that's another version of the Richard Corey argument. You shouldn't complain because some people have it worse than you, but also you shouldn't complain because some people have it better than you.